Welcome to the Litigation War Room, where you will hear great stories and great insights to raise your litigation game and win more cases. Here's your host, litigation attorney, Maxwell Goss.
Venar Ayar and Wendy Begres, welcome to the Litigation War Room.
Thank you.
$13. That's what the IRS accepted to settle a $46,000 tax debt. And in his very first case, Venar Ayar turned a $300,000 IRS bill into a $250,000 refund. Venar Ayar and Wendy Begres are partners at Ayar Law, a Michigan firm devoted to resolving tax controversies. They've represented thousands of clients facing audits, collections, criminal exposure, and IRS enforcement. Well, Venar, let's start out by talking a little bit about you and your practice and your firm. How did you get into tax dispute resolution?
That's very interesting. First of all, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having us. So I guess when I was in law school, I thought I wanted to be a business lawyer. And then I took a business class. I was in corporations class, and the corporations lawyer explained it to us like this. He said, business lawyers are kind of like tailors. Contracts are kind of like suits, and you find the one that fits close enough, and then you make it fit better. And the real planning comes from the tax lawyers. They make the decisions on a lot of the business transactions. So if you want to be, and I thought of it like, the puppeteer pulling the strings, you got to be a tax lawyer. And luckily, the school I went to at the time had it was the University of San Diego. They were very well known for their tax program. They had one of the top LLM programs in the country. So I took a tax class and I liked it. And I kept going. I went on and got my LLM in tax. So that got me into tax, and I wanted to do tax planning really bad. I thought that's what I wanted to do, or that's what I did want to do. But by the time I got out of law school, it was in May of 2008, and the economy wasn't doing so well, and there was a lot of lawyers looking for work, and the job market wasn't very good. And so I ended up spending the next 3 years looking for a job while I worked in the family business, which was groceries.
Groceries? Is that what you said?
Groceries, yeah. We had a grocery store in the inner city in Detroit, east side of Detroit.
That's cool.
So I was working at the grocery store, and I was applying for jobs, and I wasn't getting any interviews or any hits. And finally, I had a cousin in San Diego who was married to a tax controversy guy. And whenever I saw him, he would tell me how great business was. There was a lot of people behind on their taxes back in 2010, 2011, 2012. That was kind of the golden years of the tax resolution industry. And so he would tell me how good he was doing, and he offered to teach me. And so eventually I took him up, and I moved to California, and I worked for him for a year. And then I came back and started my own firm. And I resisted for a long time doing tax controversy because I thought that it wasn't going to be challenging or mentally stimulating or rewarding work. And I'm really glad now, looking back, that I did not get the jobs I was looking for, because it turned out not to be true. And tax controversy is actually a lot of fun, and I'm very happy with my decision.
Yeah. And the rest is history, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good. Well, I look forward to talking to you a little more about your practice and what you do. But Wendy, let's turn to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what's your role at the firm?
Absolutely. So during law school, I thought I wanted to work in the entertainment industry. So after graduation, I was already in California, moved to Los Angeles, and started working for William Morris, which is one of the biggest talent agencies in the world. Stayed there for a few years and decided I hated Los Angeles, hated the entertainment industry. So I wanted to come back home to Michigan. Came home, took the Michigan bar, and then I started working at a tax resolution company. And I stayed there for a few years, left when I had my daughter, and when I was home just being a mom, a mutual friend of Venar and I reached out to me and asked me, are you interested in going back to work? And so I had a conversation with Venar, and kind of the rest is history. That was about 8 years ago. My role at the firm right now is I am managing partner and CEO. So my role kind of has two sides to it. On the legal side, I oversee all of our cases. So every time a new file comes into the firm, it comes across my desk. I review it, and then I assign it out to be worked and stay involved, throughout the process to make sure that the client is getting the best service. And then on the operations side, I basically run the firm, lead the systems, training, onboarding processes, and making sure our employees are engaged and aligned, with our goals and the services that we provide.
Mm-hmm. How many employees do you guys have now?
I think it's roughly 20. No, Wendy?
Yeah, including
I
a
don't
few
know, I'm not
virtual
sure.
people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's great. That's great. In your firm, you don't do any tax planning or tax advising. It's all dispute resolution. Is that right?
That is correct.
Correct.
Well, Venar, I know you've got some good stories, and we talked a little bit about how you got into tax controversies, but tell us about some early cases that you handled.
I guess the first case I ever got when I realized that this was the industry for me. I went to San Diego, and I remember my boss telling me that I had to stay a year because it was going to take me 6 months before I can actually take a case. And then I was going to have to stay 6 more months of working before I'm ready to do it on my own. And so I got there, and it took about 6 weeks before he's like, you know what, you're pretty good. I'm going to give you a case and see how you do. And he gives me this guy who happened to be a partner at a CPA firm who was being audited by the IRS. And the IRS, his position was that he owed them like $300,000. The issue had to do with canceled debt income. He had some rental properties he owned in Hawaii, and the mortgages were forgiven. And when a mortgage is forgiven, that is generally income to you, and it's taxable, and unless you've qualified for one of a limited amount of exception. And so this guy comes in, and the issue is, was he insolvent at the time the debts were forgiven? And the client was he was pretty well off. He was a partner at a big CPA firm, made like $1 million a year. He wasn't a tax guy. He was like accounting guy, and tried to do his own returns and got himself audited. And so I had to try to see if
There's an irony there.
I had to, yeah, it was a big case for me. First one.
Oh, no,
never
I meant
done
the
this
irony of a CPA screwing up his own taxes.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the issue was whether or not he was insolvent. So I had to present to the IRS a schedule of all his assets and his liabilities. And I had to show them that the amount of his liabilities exceeded the amount of his assets. And if I was able to convince them of that, he wasn't going to owe any taxes. And if I wasn't able to convince them, he was going to owe about $300,000. And so I did my best. I didn't have many cases. It was the only one. And I presented this very detailed spreadsheet that had all of his liabilities listed out. And there was proof of every number that was on the sheet. And I had all his assets listed, and there was proof. And then I totaled them, and I made it as easy as I can for the auditor to show the math. And so I put together the package, and I also in the process was researching a lot about the laws related to the cancellation of debt income and how those transactions and how foreclosure transactions are taxed. If back in those days, a lot of people's houses were being foreclosed. And so it was an issue. That was the first time it came up. And it was a trick I learned, was that when he reported his taxes, he claimed insolvency so he wouldn't have to pay the tax on the canceled debt income. But he actually reported the foreclosure transaction wrong, and he reported that he had all these capital gains because he reported it, one way. And I found out that under the right way to do it, because of a loophole not a lot of people knew about, he was actually entitled to like $600,000 in losses. And so I found out in preparing for the case that he actually overpaid his taxes. And so we're getting ready for the interview, and my boss he was very busy. He didn't spend that much time preparing. He trusted me a lot, and I showed him that the guy was insolvent, and he tells me, all right, we're going to go meet with the auditor now. Just don't say anything. Watch how it's done. And he meets with the auditor, and he presents him with my schedules and my work, and the auditor is like, yep, it's clear. The guy is insolvent. I'm going to issue a no change report. And my boss is like, awesome, write it up, let's go. A no change report is when the auditor doesn't mean, he told me not to talk, but I couldn't help myself. And I said, no, we don't want a no change report. Stop. What are you doing? You owe us money. I want a refund. And I showed him, and he didn't want to, he said, well, audit your returns later. That's not my problem. I said, no, we're not going to amend our returns later. You chose to audit it, and there's a mistake. You need to fix it, whether it's a refund. And I fought with him for like a week back and forth. And eventually I got him to agree. Yeah, the guy got this huge loss that wiped out all his taxes for the year and also created a carryback. So it's created an opportunity to amend the last 3 years. And I ended up getting him back like $250,000. He went from owing $300,000 to making $250,000. And it was a very valuable lesson. I luckily got to win. You know, I got to learn early on, and needless to say, my boss was very happy. I turned this big $300,000 case into a $250,000 refund.
Yeah, no doubt.
I was happy. And that's when I realized, I said, man, this is a lot of fun. You really get to figure stuff out and use your brain. And it could be challenging, and you can win by outsmarting the other side. And going into when I started tax review, it was like, well, this is the only work that's out there. I'm going to do it. And I thought it was just going to be like setting up payment plans and filling out tax forms stuff. And then I get in it. In my very first case, I get an opportunity to really dig deep and to find most people would not have found, I mean, not to brag, but I don't think most people would have found the mistake I found that triggered the big loans that got him the $250,000 in refunds, you know. Yeah. And I realized I can have make a really big difference.
What a great story. Great litigators understand that you want to be the trusted authority. You're standing in the courtroom. You want to be the one that is credible, that's reliable, the judge looks to get a reliable account of the facts and the law. Or when you're writing, you want to be the one who the judge's clerk quotes or pulls authorities from. And I think that's very consistent with what you said, too. You want the IRS rep that you're negotiating with or arguing with to look to you and to look to your work and say, oh, this guy's work is reliable.
Yeah. One of the other early cases I had in California that really I took with me, I was a woman her name was Catherine. And she came to us really from a desperate position. This woman her husband was a stock trader. He was doing really well for a time. And then the economy crashed and he lost all their money and he split. And he left, and he was trading in her name. And he left to like LA and left her with this child that they had adopted from an adoption agency. And then didn't file the taxes, didn't do anything. And she just had to kind of figure it all out on her own. And one of the issues was that he sold millions of dollars worth of stock. And back then, the stock brokerages didn't report your cost basis to the IRS. They just reported the sale proceeds. So if you sell a bunch of stock and then you don't file your tax returns, the IRS will take the most conservative position, which is you got the stock for free and it's all profit. And so when you have millions of dollars in stock transactions, even though you lost your life savings in the process, if you don't file your returns, the IRS is going to send you this giant bill. And it's an easy fix, you just got to file your returns and they'll fix it. But what happened to this woman was she had gone to this chop shop. Back in those days, there was a lot of disreputable tax resolution companies that were advertising all over the TV and radios. Less so today because there's less money in the industry. But back then, when the economy was in free fall, there were vultures everywhere. And you don't have to be an attorney to represent people before the IRS. So there's a lot of firms out there that are not subject to state bar oversight, that are allowed to just sell tax. They advertise that they have tax attorneys, but the organization itself is not a law firm and they're not subject to state farm regulation. And it invites a lot of people who will promise you all kinds of things and not deliver it. And so the lady who lost her money, it was like $3,000 retainer she gave her and didn't get it back. In the meantime, she got these substitute returns filed for her by the state of California. And then the state of California starts garnishing her wages. And she came to us like 3 years later, 4 years later, after being garnished. She still went to work every day. She wasn't getting paid. She was getting like $26 a week. Went to work for like 4 years. She was living in her parking lot, in the parking lot of her job, in a car with her adopted son. And she came to us because one of her other kids, her adult children, gave her some more money. Said, look, I'm going to give you some money. Go hire somebody else. She just thought it was hopeless after she got screwed the first time. And she came to us and she said, I'm going to take my son back to the orphan. And because I can't afford to support him. And I took like one look at her case and I was like, oh my gosh, you don't even owe any money. You've been homeless for 4 years for like no reason. So literally all we had to do, the first thing I did was I called the state of California and I told them that she's uncollectible and got them to release the garnishment. Like they won't. So she gets her paychecks back.
Wow. Uh-huh.
And then I filed her returns going back 4 years for one. She could only get 1 year's. She wasn't able to get all her money back, but I got a lot of her money back to the point where the state of California wrote her a check for like $30,000.
Wow.
Yeah. She was able to get an apartment and furniture.
A lot of money for anybody. I'm sure it felt like a lot of money for her in particular.
It was a big case. It was very moving. She came to me after with her son and he thanked me and you get to like really make a difference for people, you know?
Yeah, that's fantastic. Venar, real quick, I just have to ask you one more. Tell us about the case you settled for $13.
Oh my gosh. This was like one of the early cases I got after I started my own firm. So, you know, one of the common things everybody wants to do when they owe the IRS money is they hear about the offer and compromise program. And that's the one that's advertised. You can settle for pennies on the dollar. Everybody's heard about it. These big mills and these chop shops. That's what they're selling everybody, the dream of you can do an offer and compromise. But the fact is not everybody qualifies. You know, the way the offer and compromise program works is if you can convince the IRS that you're never going to be able to pay them back, then they will settle for whatever you got. In, you know, a broad oversimplification, there's a formula for what the minimum offer amount is. And so they'll settle for whatever you got. Once you cross the hurdle of showing that you're never going to be able to pay it back. So sometimes, like when you apply the formula, you come up with, if you plan right, you know, make sure the guy pays all his bills first and make sure that, you know, they get a car, so they have a car payment in their budget, they get their life insurance. You know, there's a lot of planning that goes into strategizing somebody. Then you could position them where the formula for the minimum offer amount is like some nominal dollar amount. I've settled for as little as $1. Now, at my old firm in San Diego, the guy who taught me the business, he used to have a philosophy that you always, quote unquote, juice the pot on an offer. Figure out what the minimum is and offer them like $5,000 more. Because you got to juice the pot. You got to give it something in them to make the offer more palatable for the person reviewing it. And I used to argue with him. I said, you're wasting people's money. These are government employees we're talking about. They don't care whether you settle for $5,000 or $7,000 or $36. I said, why are you offering ever $1 more than the absolute minimum that their guidelines say is acceptable? Because one thing that I learned is that when you're dealing with the IRS, it's different than dealing with a private party because they're not allowed to use their common sense and good judgment. It's forbidden because there's something called the Equal Protection Clause. And so they have to treat similarly situated citizens the same. And what that results in is objective guidelines that they have to follow. And it's not, well, you know, use your common sense. It's, these are the guidelines and they have to apply to everybody because that's the way the country's laws work. So when I opened my own firm and I finally got to do things my way, I said, I'm going to test it. And I did the formulas and the guy qualified for a $13 settlement on a $46,000 debt. He didn't have any money. He was living on Social Security. They were never going to get any money out of him anyway. So $13 was $13 more than they could have got by enforcement. So I said, we'll offer them $13. And usually the way it works is when you do an offer in compromise, you send the package in, and then like a year later, they'll call you and they'll want to go over it and they'll want to try to ask more questions or ask for more documents or any. In his case, that didn't even happen. We sent in the offer, and a year later, we got a letter back saying, congratulations, your offer is accepted. You have 5 months to pay $13. And he made one payment one time with $13 and wiped out almost $50,000 in tax debt. And I got my vindication because I knew all along, I knew my boss was just throwing money away.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Wow.
told him, I was like, I think he still juices the pot too because he's stubborn. You'll never admit you was wrong. So since then, I offer the minimum or less because there are some exceptions to the minimums, and you can always present exceptions. And when I do an offer in compromise, if I think the IRS might take $10,000, I'm going to offer $2,000 because they don't just reject them, they counter you. And then you got to put 20% down. So I want to minimize somebody's exposure. So I don't juice the pot. I do the opposite. If you offer less than the minimum, great. If you offer, but the absolute max we'll ever offer on it is what the absolute minimum that they'll accept.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. Those are great stories. Wendy, I'd love to hear some of your insights and some of your perspective. Sounds like you're involved in both sides of the firm, handling disputes, but also running the firm itself. I think most of our listeners probably are not, well, they're definitely not tax specialists. And I think it'd be useful for the lawyers and litigators in our office to hear about some of the more common challenges that clients face.
Most common challenges we see are, unfiled returns, audits that have spiraled out of control, and then, our collection actions. So levies, liens, things like that. Usually when people come to us, they're already in a crisis mode. So, their accounts might have been frozen or their wages could have been hit, or they have an auditor that is drawing, their own conclusions.
And are there particular mistakes or blunders that you see your clients making that make things harder for you to fix?
Talking too much. It's a real common one, especially in audits. If somebody tries to handle it on their own and not really thinking about what was said or what documents, were given over, that presents a challenge for us. Yeah, I mean, it's not our job to judge really how somebody got there. It's our job to figure out how to get them out of that tough situation.
Yeah, for sure. Do you handle tax controversies for both businesses and individuals, or just individuals?
Yeah, both.
What are some of the problems that businesses face as opposed to individuals?
Most common issue, I would say, is unpaid payroll taxes. That's really probably the number one reason that small businesses shut down. It's because they're not able to make it. And the IRS sees that as probably one of the most serious issues, when a business doesn't pay over the employee portion of the taxes. And then the IRS turns and will try to hold an individual responsible. So it could be an owner, it could be a check signer. They try to get as many people as they can at that point on the hook to then recover the unpaid taxes.
Wow. Is that as a matter of course that the individual owner, decision maker, check signer can be held liable, or is there a certain showing the IRS estimate?
Yeah, if it gets to that point, then the IRS does what's called a trust fund recovery penalty. And they'll hold interviews with various people trying to see really, who was willful and made the decision not to pay the taxes and what other bills, maybe were paid instead of the taxes.
What are some early signs that you may have a possible IRS criminal investigation on your hands?
We've had a lot of criminal cases come through our office. The craziest one I had is one we're actually still fighting over, where a business owner got criminally charged for not paying over his payroll taxes. You've only got $100,000, which when you're talking about a business and their payroll tax, because that's all of your employees' taxes,
Yeah.
and those numbers add up quickly. You're usually talking about big money, and the test for whether or not you're criminally liable is the same as the test as to whether or not you're civilly, personally liable for not paying. It's whether you willfully failed to pay over the taxes. And if the IRS can prove that you just chose to pay somebody else, even if it was out of necessity, your business was going to go under unless you paid the landlord. You had to keep the lights on. And so you took the money from the payroll taxes and paid. They got you. That's the rights. You're willful. And then, so I had a case, but the only thing that saves people is prosecutorial discretion. The IRS can't take every case. So most 99 times out of 100, if a business fails to pay their payroll tax, the IRS agent's going to show up. They're going to try to work out a payment plan with you. And unless you really piss them off, you'll be fine. But in this one case, looking back at the file, it's clear to me somebody inside the government, much higher up than the revenue officer, had it out to get this guy because he was working. He was very cooperative. We didn't represent him through the civil investigation. We didn't represent him through the criminal investigation. He didn't come to us until they had already convened the grand jury. And there was a lot of things that could have prevented it before then. But when he was working the case civilly with the revenue officer, he was nice. He was working on getting his taxes filed. And then one day he just didn't hear from her. And the next thing he knows, the criminal guys show up and he didn't take it seriously. And he subjected himself to an interview. And then he didn't hear from them again. And then one day, several years later, he hears from the U.S. attorney that, hey, we got a grand jury out. We're about to indict you. And that's when he finally came to us. And he had a very strong and very valid defense, was that he left the business in the hands of his bookkeeper. She was in charge of paying the bills, and she didn't tell him she wasn't paying the taxes.
Uh-huh.
And the next bookkeeper that came in testified that he was surprised when she told him the taxes weren't paid. He was surprised, and he argued with her about it. And so, but unfortunately, because nobody put forward these defenses at the early stages of the case, the prosecutor took it, convened the grand jury. And then one thing I learned is that once you get to that point, there's a less than 1% chance they're going to let it go. You got to beat them at trial. No matter how bad the case is, the prosecutor's not going to admit that he took a bad case.
Right.
And he took the case, and he's got all these hours in, and they're going to do everything they can to indict you. And I used to have a high view of the Department of Justice and the government in general. And I learned through that case that they will do anything it takes to win, even more so than private attorneys, some of them at least, dirty or clean. And that I also learned that it's hard to beat them in court. I think that judges give a lot of deference to government employees.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a very high burden.
My next question is really for both of you. Does the IRS does it have a particular playbook or process
Oh, yeah.
that it follows?
There's an employee I call it the IRS employee handbook. The legal name is called the Internal Revenue Manual. It's the manual that all the employees have to follow that gives them guidance on how to deal with any particular situation. And it's publicly available. That's what I learned was that when you deal with administrative practice, it's the opposite. The persuasiveness of the authority is the opposite of what it is in court. The most persuasive authority I can present to somebody is a provision of the Internal Revenue Manual. I'm dealing with an IRS agent. They're just doing their job. If I start talking to them about constitutional law and due process, they tell you talk to the lawyers about that.
Their eyes glaze over, right?
Yeah. So we save those arguments for courts and for appeals, and we do a lot of work. We do a lot of research in the Internal Revenue Manual. I think it's great that it's publicly available. It's unfortunately the state of Michigan doesn't have one that's available to the public. I think the IRS is well written, well organized. It's written for the audience of an IRS agent. So there's a lot of stuff in there that's just about like computer codes and how to input this and how to input that, and you got to kind of skim past that. But then all the dispute, if they're not doing something that you want them to do, or they're doing something that you don't want them to do, then you got to find something in the Internal Revenue Manual that says that they're not supposed to be doing that. And so that's always the first place we look.
Well, I'd like to pivot here and kind of wrap up by talking about your your firms. I know you guys have grown a lot in a short period of time. I read something that you wrote saying that you grew from about 100 clients to about 2,500 in a very short period of time. Tell us what drove that and some of the growing pains and challenges you experienced.
I think what drove that was temporary work. We had a lot of work we did in the COVID relief. There was a tax credit we did a lot for people called the Employee Retention Tax Credit. And I just saw an opportunity to help a lot of people. When this program was out, a lot of people didn't know how it worked, at least at first. Eventually, it got kind of widespread knowledge among the business community, but early on, there was a huge opportunity to present this to people. And I was very fortunate that my background is marketing. Before I went to law school, I was a marketing student. And I happened to have other businesses that I own in the marketing space. And one of them is a call center where I do telemarketing. And so during COVID, starting in like 2021 through about 2024, there was a lot of people out there who needed help claiming this employee retention tax credit. And so I turned up the marketing machine as fast as I can. I started doing direct mail campaigns and radio ads and cold call outreach and internet ads. And I wanted to hire as many clients as I can because a lot of these people had hundreds of thousands of dollars that come into them that they didn't know about. And I was going to make sure to claim as much as I can. And so we had to scale up very fast. It was a very stressful time. We grew a lot. We made some mistakes along the way. We had to build the train as it was rolling down the tracks. My processes were in a constant state of change because I'm constantly moving up to the next scale, hiring the next 5 employees. And, it just became a thing. I'm glad that chapter is behind me and we're back to our normal size. It was a lot of fun and it was financially very rewarding for me. I'm, not complaining, but I'm glad to get over the hump and now I'm focused on back to doing tax controversy. And I have my other businesses. I have a mass tort law firm too, that maybe another day we can talk about that. I am really good at finding people who need lawyers. And so I send a lot of referrals in the mass tort world.
Oh, that's great. Well, let me ask a question to wrap up. I'd love to hear from both of you on it. What's one thing you wish every lawyer understood about dealing with the IRS?
It's not that hard. I mean, simple cases are not that hard, like getting somebody on a payment plan, or like if you have a client that just can't pay, getting them on non-collectibles debts. One of the things I love about tax law is that everybody else is so scared to do it. So it's really, and for most cases, you don't really have to know about the substantive part of tax because most of the times it's cut and dry. They either paid their tax or they didn't. Like a lot of cases can be streamed. Non-tax lawyers who were like just hanging their shingle and wanted to get some work in the door could do these collections. You get their returns filed. You partner with an accountant, you get them on a payment plan, you do an offer and compromise, that's like 80% of the clients who come on the door. You don't really need to know the first thing about substantive tax. You just kind of need to know about the administrative procedures and where are the options available and how to probably. Now, there are cases where knowing the substantive part of tax is a huge advantage. And, you might be able to find opportunities to lower somebody's taxes. Somebody couldn't do all the work who doesn't have a tax background, but 80% of the stuff that comes in my door, any general practitioner rolled up their sleeves and kind of did a little bit of research and homework and can probably do the work. And so I'm always telling young lawyers, like, if you get a simple call, even if they want to call me, like I'll tell them this is what you should do on a case like this. I'll tell them if they're in over their head and we should refer it to an expert, or if it's something that's kind of simple, because anything's better than letting people call those mills that left by one point homeless,
Well, I think that's something that as attorneys in almost any area we practice in, sooner or later, we run into tax issues and clients with tax issues. So number one, these are certainly helpful insights. And number two, certainly helpful, at least for me, knowing where to send these cases. So where can listeners find you guys if they want to learn more about your practice and your firm?
I think the best place is our website. It's ayarlaw.com, AYAR law.com. Our office is in Farmington Hills, Michigan. We serve clients all over the country, but mostly centered around Metro Detroit.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, Wendy, Venar,
I guess
Really
the other thing
appreciate-
I'd like to add is that we are opening a second office in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we're
Oh, wow.
excited for that. January 1st is the start of our lease. We have an attorney. His name is Eric Vander Wyden's going to be heading up that office, and we're very excited to enter into a new market. So, West Michigan followers can look for us in a couple months over there.
Oh, good for you. Good for you. That's exciting. We'll definitely watch for that. So okay. Well, Wendy, Venar, this was a great conversation. Really appreciate you making time for this. Thanks so much for appearing on the Litigation War Room.
Thank you
Thanks for having us.
You have been listening to the Litigation War Room with litigation attorney Maxwell Goss. Maxwell Goss brings forceful advocacy and creative solutions to trade secret, IP, and business cases in Michigan and around the country. For show notes and more episodes, please visit us at thelitigationwarroom.com. If you enjoy the show, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening. The Litigation War Room, including the podcast and all website content and social media, is for informational and entertainment purposes only. This podcast does not provide legal advice and does not give rise to an attorney-client relationship. All views and opinions expressed on this podcast belong to the guests expressing them and do not reflect the views and opinions of the Litigation War Room.